Welcome. You're listening to Expat Radio. I'm Bill Anderson and I'm coming live from the Costa del Sol. I want to welcome my guest for today, who is... Now, do we do the official Andrew Oliver or Andy Oliver? Welcome, Andy.
It's Andy. Only my mum gets to call me Andrew.
I think that's fair enough. It's a bit like me with the William. It was only my mother that ever called me William, you know. Andy, welcome to Expat Radio. And, well, you are actually not very far away from me right at the moment on the Costa del Sol.
Correct.
And we're gonna start unraveling some of these bits, Andy. But tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are you from originally?
Wow. Okay, so originally I was dragged up in Sunderland. And the penance for life is being a Sunderland supporter. Full of disappointment, but never mind. Then 18 left home, went to university in Leeds, studied Spanish and Portuguese. Then took not a gap year, but part of the course. Went to Ceuta to learn Spanish on the basis that I didn't know where it was, and there's probably no English people there.
Yes.
Left or graduated, then joined the armed forces as an officer, served in the parachute regiment. Then after that, I sadly got shot in my ankle, left the forces and started looking for jobs which paid lots of money for people who could jump out of airplanes, run a long way and shoot straight. And there weren't any. So I joined financial services in the UK and have trained up ever since from then, taking lots of exams to be a financial advisor, an investment manager.
Yeah. And you know, you're probably quite a rare breed, Andy, the fact that you actually studied Spanish and then eventually, and we'll talk about how that happened, came to set up a business in Spain.
Right.
Because there are an awful lot of people who want to come here and work. And I know it's more complicated since Brexit, but I'm talking about over the last 20, 30 years. And many of them haven't made it simply because they didn't speak Spanish and couldn't get into the Spanish way of thinking and of doing things. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think it is fair, and it's people say that when you can speak a language, a second language, you start to think in that language. And that certainly happened to me in Ceuta. And so I didn't have to think anymore about what I was saying. And so, Spanish, who are lovely people, they become, I think, more helpful or have been more helpful towards me, all right, in business, certainly, and helping things happen because of the fact that I could speak Spanish.
Yeah.
And that's almost notable when, there's an assumption sometimes that a Brit won't be able to speak Spanish. And it's a pleasant surprise when that happens. And you see that on their faces.
Yeah, and you have got listeners from all around the world, literally. I think you should tell them where Ceuta is, because probably most people have never heard of it.
Okay, so Ceuta is a Spanish enclave in North Africa, in Morocco.
Right.
And it's interesting. It's right opposite Gibraltar. So whilst on one side we've got a lot of Spain saying, give us Gibraltar back, staring it in the face on the other side of the Strait of Gibraltar is this enclave which belongs to Spain, annexed from Morocco.
Yeah. I guess it doesn't really resemble the Costa del Sol very much, where everybody speaks English and.
No, there was nobody that spoke English.
Yeah.
Absolutely, kind of nobody, apart from the English teacher in the local college.
Right.
And that was fundamentally the reason that I went, because a lot of my friends, they went to places like Valencia, Madrid, Barcelona to join in with the Spanish way of life there. But because there were so many Brits, or 4 or 5 students went to the same place, then they all ended up living together in the same house, going out together, and didn't manage really to get into the Spanish way of life.
Yeah, that's interesting you say that, Andy, because before I came out to Spain, I decided to retrain as an English teacher. I thought that was what I was going to do out here. And I was doing my CELTA course in Edinburgh, and exactly the same thing that you're describing there happened in Edinburgh. About 5% of the population of Edinburgh is Spanish. And
Wow.
all these Spaniards were coming in for their daily English lessons and then going back with all their Spanish mates and not talking Spanish until English rather until the next day. And this kind of immersion situation that you describe is by far the best way, isn't it? Because it drives necessity.
It does. It does. And when you don't know a word, I remember walking to a shop in theatre needing a mop, and I didn't have a clue what the word for a mop was. And I did. I had to act out mopping the floor. And I'm sure the guy that was in the hardware shop, right, thought it was so hilarious. He just pretended not to understand. That was half an hour of pretend mopping.
Yeah.
But hey, necessity.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in the same type of situation, Andy, that, I had an apartment here before I moved out here, and my Spanish was very limited. And had a leak in the bathroom, one of the pipes in the bathroom. And I remember getting my dictionary out and listing a lot of words so as I could go and talk to somebody and describe what it was.
Correct. Yeah.
So,
Been there.
so you spent some time while you were studying in Ceuta, Andy. How much later than that did Spain come along for you?
My word, that's got to be 15 years later.
Right.
So yeah, some of the languages, there's memory fade. Some of the words are gone, but they came back quite quickly. But
Yeah.
it was 15 years later.
Yeah. And you explained that you were injured whilst in the army,
Hmm.
and you decided to retrain as a financial consultant. Um, what was the world of financial consultancy like in those days?
Far less complicated than it is now. But I was taught to, in the beginning anyway, that we were there, and I still believe this very strongly, that our job is to persuade people to do the right thing with their money, and that retirement for like a lot of people in their 30s and 40s seems a long, long way off, but
Right.
it creeps up on people very, very quickly. People are scared of taking financial decisions sometimes on the basis that they don't fully understand both the upside and also the risk.
Right.
They sometimes don't understand the tax issues which they're going to face at some point in time as well. And so we were there to ask people about what they had and then to come up with a plan to try and help them to grow their money, to make them better off, and to minimize exposure to nasty tax shocks and nasty surprises.
Right.
Um, yeah.
But like many professions, there have been, bad experiences with, let's just say, cowboys in this sort of business. Is that something that you've had to sort of fight against in setting up your own wealth management services?
Um, I think that's a really good question. I think when I first arrived in Spain to do this and set a business up, which I then subsequently sold in 2007.
Right.
And I think the Costa del Sol at that point in time, you're right, was full of um, non-regulated individuals, right, who'd one day been, I don't know, selling cars, and the next day they became financial advisors.
Sure.
Um, and I think the commissions that were then payable were sky high. They
Right.
were dreadful. I think the disclosure was awful. Um, and it just wasn't a very clean industry. It was in the UK. So that kind of scam thing or that unprofessional image wasn't there. But when I arrived here, it was a big shock, a huge shock. And so our stance had to be, and this probably cost us business, but our stance had to be, we tell the client absolutely everything. There's nothing hidden.
Yeah.
It's all transparent, all up front. But of course, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, uh, when we first got here, the, because that wasn't the case, people could tell or say anything they like. And if I'm saying to a client, it will cost you X, Y, and Z, and a realistic rate of return is 7% a year, and you had somebody next door not saying that the fees were what they really were,
Right.
so I say, actually, we can get you 10%, that's going to lose people business. But I think that right across the industry has cleaned itself up a lot.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I have to say, Andy, not because it's you I'm talking to right now, but probably one of the reasons I am talking to you right now is that people that I know around here who have actually legitimately been in the sort of wealth management business actually speak very highly of PCC, private client consultancy wealth management. They speak very highly of the company, the ethics, the approach, and the transparency that as a company you offer to people who come to speak to you.
That's great to hear. Great feedback, and that's what we try to do. Which it's something that when Holly and I set this up, it was something. In fact, the number one criteria we had was just to make sure that we did everything for the client.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to talk a little bit more about the wealth management side, Andy, in just a moment. But why Costa del Sol? What made that break over here? Just because it was sunnier here?
It was. I was working in London. All right. I'd already bought a house in the Costa del Sol during the property boom. And we bought it to do that kind of go on holiday or residential tourism and also to let it out at times as well. And yeah, I was walking along London Wall one day and it was absolutely chucking it down with rain. Right? It was miserable. I was getting up at an earthly hour in the morning, getting the tube and then the train in, all right, into central London and getting the tube across and then walking for the last 500 meters. And it was just dire. I think my football team had just been relegated again.
Right.
So life wasn't looking very good, right? And I got a phone call from a recruitment consultant who asked me, do I know anybody like me, but who spoke Spanish? So I said to Alan, well, I do. And so he was quite intrigued and said, well, go speak Spanish to me. So I did. And so I was asked to come out and start distribution right over here. And it was really a no-brainer just to come here because there was a place to live. And I knew the area anyway. That's why.
So that was why. Any regrets of making the move to the Iberian Peninsula? Because I'm going to keep the other bit for later.
Okay. Any regrets? No, actually, none whatsoever.
Yeah.
None whatsoever. And do I miss anything from home or from the UK? Not that much.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been here 20 years this year, actually. And I find it very hard to even imagine going back to what you just described about what the tube and the trains into work and the murky weather and the wet and the cold, and I don't think I could actually imagine living back in that situation again after 20 years here.
Yeah, I'm like you.
Yeah. So, Andy, let's talk a little bit about this whole thing about wealth management. What do you reckon are the biggest mistakes that people make in terms of looking after their savings? Let's just call it their savings.
Oh, yeah. Okay. The biggest mistake, number one, a big mistake people do make is leaving decisions too late. So, for example, if you save for retirement and you start in your 30s or 20s, wow, you've got a fantastic head start. I think too many people, though, who either inherit money or build up money, leave it in the bank for too long.
Right.
And fundamentally, there's only two winners. One's the bank, or three winners rather, bank, taxman, and the people who the bank lends their money to in the terms of a mortgage,
right,
because the house gets capital growth. And if you work out the actual rate of return of money or cash sat there, it's negative. So the value of it actually shrinks.
Yeah.
And I think they leave it there, or in my experience, people leave it there because they're frightened of the volatility or the ups and downs of a stock market,
right,
or a bond market, or any market, in fact. And because they don't understand, or people, I think, haven't, and I think financial education in the UK definitely needs to, or the education system needs to step in here somehow and teach young people, right, how to look after money, make money, manage money, right, and what it means, or manage wealth, I'm going to say.
Yeah.
So it's that fear of the unknown, okay, rather than letting go a bit and just not even testing it, but just having faith that a stock market doesn't go into terminal decline. It has bumps and bruises along the way, but in the main, it rises and rises very nicely.
Yeah. But do you think that there are people, I'm in my 60s now, do you think that there are people who still have this kind of notion in their head of money in the bank? I've got money in the bank.
Yeah.
And with that comes this kind of sense of security because I've got money in the bank.
Correct. I think so, and I think that's a very cultural thing with UK individuals. Because I remember my granny, and she had a post office account, she had a bank account with Lloyd's, and then she would have 4 pots of coins. Right. And some was for the food and the housekeeping. Others was to pay the coalman, the milkman, etc. And so, people were taught to budget very well, and cash was king. Cash sometimes isn't king. It's really not. And I think the other mistake that people make, or trap they fall into, is where expats get together, and where we are at the moment, in Lacala, the Micas, it's predominantly expats. And of course, they'll go to a local cafe and talk, and what becomes myth, right, becomes fact. And this coffee shop talk drives me crazy. Because a guy down the road told his sister's brother's uncle that something happened in the stock market, or in cash, or in tax, or what have you, and all of a sudden becomes fact. And that can be quite difficult to get around.
Yeah, I think a few of us know Bob down the bar.
Yeah.
Bob down the bar told me. And
Correct.
I think regardless of whether in your line of work, or my friend and colleague Anand is talking about Brexit, or me in the sort of local political life, Bob down the bar is the source of a lot of bad information.
Correct. But hey, Bob down the bar will be there for a long, long time, I think.
Yeah. So you came over here, and you were working for someone else initially when you came over then?
Correct. So working for somebody else when I came over initially, and and it was just before the financial crash in 2008.
Right.
And this group had funded the first 7 or 8 months of setting up a business. Mm-hmm. Then it decided that because of the financial crash, it needed a contract. So they said, we're going to close it down, or you can buy it. And by that time, the flywheel had been turned so many times, it had some momentum, right? And we had clients, and we had a brand, and we had everything set up, which is the first 6 months of establishing a business, or 7 months, is all the difficult bits get, the grubby, gritty tasks get done. And so they sold it to me for not very much money. In fact, it was exactly €1.
Right.
So I had a ready-made business.
Right.
That then got sold to somebody else. All right, who stepped in a couple of years later, and there was quite a decent offer on the table. I stayed with that business, who bought it for a number of years afterwards, and then 2 years ago, Holly and I decided to step away from that business and set up private client consultancy.
Right.
Yeah.
And it has been a very nice, I think, addition to the kinds of services that are available in a place like Mijas. And I know you don't just deal with Mijas, because we've got Marbella on one side, Fuengirola on the other side, Benalmádena just on the other side there. And when you start adding up, and I'm only talking about Brits here, but when you start adding up the number of Brits just along this stretch of the coast, it's phenomenal, isn't it?
It's incredible. It is incredible. But all of the other countries which are and not just Costa del Sol, but the other kind of popular expat areas, Costa Blanca, for example, it's almost It's almost a replica
Yeah.
of the Costa del Sol, the Algarve, a replica of the Costa del Sol.
Really.
So there's lots of ponds to fish in for clients, if you like, or lots of places that we should be, and that we have got clients in as well. But this is a firm favourite.
Yeah.
Down in Marbella. Yeah.
And for those that don't know, I mean, I know that your symbol is a tree.
hmm
Tell us about that, Andy. What is it you're communicating with the tree symbol?
Okay. Well, this was chosen by my wife, right?
It
And
would
once
be.
she made that decision, that I was no way was I going to get to choose the logo of the brand, right? But and people love it. So, but behind it was it's the tree of life, okay, and that life brings lots and lots of challenges to people, and what we are here to do is to help people live their lives really comfortably
Right.
financially. And it was that sort of discussion, etc., which went on. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's well, I have to say to your wife that I think she made a very wise choice here. Because you know the last thing you want is a kind of dollar sign, big gold dollar sign or something, because
Yeah,
you know this isn't just about making money, is it? It is about creating security for people.
exactly. Exactly. And as long as you put that first, that the client wins and wins and wins and wins all the time,
Uh-huh.
right? Then, we do make money, and money will make more money as well because we're treating clients fairly. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
This is maybe I'm going to come back to what we're talking about, but this is maybe a bit sort of off the wall question, Andy. How do you see the rise in digital currency affecting your clients, for example, at the moment?
Um, Great question. So digital currency, the cryptos. I, I, Most people that I talk to have bought a few €100 worth of crypto
Right.
because they were curious. Um, I don't think it will affect the retail client very much on the basis that there's actually not that many people out there who really understand crypto.
Yeah.
Um, and because of that, people are really super scared of it and super skeptical.
Yeah.
Um, and so they also know that when you get a 3,000% rise in crypto, right, then you can get a 3,000% fall as well.
Right.
So that volatility, yeah, I think puts people's guard up. I don't see a big appetite for it in the retail market.
Yeah.
There's, we get a couple of inquiries about crypto funds. We don't recommend them, very much, literally because it's a brand new thing. It's not regulated, and as soon as a central bank or a government starts to regulate something, then that puts extra strains and stresses on it, and so it will have a bumpy ride. Um, when it matures as an asset class in, let's say, 30, 40 years, then I think it'll be more common.
Yeah, I'm very wary of it. I know people who say they're making a fortune, but actually it kind of feels making a fortune on paper with very little to back it up. And unless you take your money out when you're making a fortune, as you say, you could wake up the next morning and find that you've lost a fortune.
Yeah, and absolutely. And hey, my favorite question: if crypto or Bitcoin is a real currency, why is it always expressed in the value of dollars? Okay,
Uh,
so there's kind of one clue. But I mean, a real life story, which is a good news story. One client of ours, he invested not very much, about 15,000 euros into crypto, Ethereum, about 6 years ago.
mm,
And his 15,000 turned into 3 million.
wow.
Yeah. So it can go really, really well.
Mm,
I then met him and I asked him to politely, right, remove at least a third and de-risk himself. He thought it was going to keep going up. He did de-risk himself, and took a third away, sold a third, but kept 2 million euros in crypto. And unfortunately, that 2 million is back down to 500,000.
Right. Yeah.
And that was based in 6 months.
Yeah. We were introduced to someone up in Micas Pueblo, and we were sitting chatting, and this topic came up, and he said, "Oh yeah, yeah." He said, "I was a millionaire, but I got up in the morning and found I was broke."
Correct. So it can happen.
Yeah.
But it's not something we find as mainstream.
Andy, we're going to take a short commercial break or song break, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. And I want to talk about your little change of location from the Costa del Sol to Portugal, and I want you to talk us through that. Back in
All
a
right.
few minutes.
Look forward to it.
Welcome back. I'm Bill Anderson. I'm coming live from the Costa del Sol with my guest today, Andy Oliver, from PCC, which is Private Client Consultancy Wealth Management. Andy, welcome back.
Thank you.
So, you mentioned a couple of the biggest mistakes that people make, and leaving things too late, Andy, and leaving too much money in the bank. Is there anything else you want to just highlight for us about some of the major errors that people make with protecting the value of their wealth?
I just noticed one of your adverts about transferring pensions there, and as if we were missold a pension. One of them is, I think people tend to ignore their retirement for too long until it's too late. Mm-hmm. And people also, especially British, come to a place like Spain or Portugal, Germany, or wherever in the world, and what they do, they still think in terms of what they did in the UK.
Right.
So as an example, an ISA in the UK is a brilliant vehicle because you can invest in either cash or bonds or stocks and shares or mutual funds, and it grows tax-free. Mm-hmm. And then also the proceeds, when you take them out and spend them, are tax-free.
Right.
Unfortunately, an ISA doesn't do that in Spain or anywhere else in the world.
Right.
But still, they've got this tax-free sort of myth about it. But as soon as they step foot in Spain, right, then it's taxable. And so what I think, we do naturally is we not ignore, but we tend to, as human beings, sometimes bury our heads in the sand and leave issues, all right, such as frozen pensions, all right, or deferred pensions. Frozen pensions is a naughty word, but is deferred pensions. And sometimes people see final salary pensions that they've got left in the UK, right, as being gold-plated. And that's the way that journalists described them, right, for decades. Unfortunately, they don't always suit people's circumstances. They've got some very, very decent, very, very good features about them, such as the investment risk is sat with the company. However, if somebody dies, then the death benefits are usually quite mean and quite stingy. They see them as being inflation-proofed, and that's good, except when inflation goes above 3%, right, or 5% for some other parts of the schemes, all right, other layers of income, and it is at 10% at the moment. So that income, right, is only going up at 3 to 5%, right? However, inflation, right, is going up by 10.
Right.
And so the design of those schemes was designed in the 70s and the 80s when they were designed around what retirement looked like back then. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, retirement's changed for people. People in the 70s, right, the majority didn't emigrate to another country. They typically would stay in the UK. So there's currency risk there, there's tax risk, there's all sorts of risk. And so they're designed, because it was designed for something 30 to 40 years ago, there's clearly now design faults with some UK pensions. Yeah. But not even exploring options, I suppose, is the best way to say it's possibly the biggest mistake that people make.
Yeah, and I guess what you're describing there has probably hit a lot of people, that what might be perceived or what might actually be tax-free in the UK, once that money or once your tax residency changes, the chances are it's not going to be tax free in your new country of residence.
Correct. 100% correct. Yeah. And that's, you know, that sort of thing is worth exploring for many people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Andy, you came down here, Costa del Sol, you set up the business here, and then you moved somewhere else. Is that true?
Correct. We moved to Portugal. I live in Portugal, and we've got a business in Portugal as well,
Right.
an office in Portugal, um, and run the business from there. Which, with Zoom and Microsoft Teams, etc., is much easier to do now than maybe it was 5, 6, 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And taking it from a very sort of personal perspective first, do you find that Portugal is a very different place to live in than, and I'm going to say the Costa del Sol, because the Costa del Sol is not all of Spain. Do you find a big difference in just the living circumstances, the quality of life? How would you describe that, Andy?
That's a really good question. And there is a big difference. So probably the most notable difference is the speed or the pace of life. Okay, it's where I found in the Costa del Sol everything was fast and furious, especially in the summer. But everything's a little bit more frantic. Portugal is a little bit more laid back.
Right.
Yeah, and they know that it's laid back, and they know that they insist that that's their way of life. I mean, so much so that an estate agent that we used, Holly and I, to rent the office building from in Portugal, it was, or to buy or to rent, whatever we were going to do. And the inquiry was, please can we come in and speak to you, speak about the office next door, which it was next door to his office. And he went, no, I'm about to go on my lunch. I'll be back in 2 hours. And he just laughed. And it was like, this is crazy. But that's the kind of prevailing attitude.
Right.
And you get used to it. So sometimes getting things done there is frustrating. But as soon as I suppose you accept that's life, that's what's going to happen, then actually, in lots of ways, it's much more enjoyable.
Right. Okay. And is it from a sort of bureaucratic point of view? Is it as difficult, complicated, long as Spain?
No, it's not.
Right.
Thankfully, I just find though that some of their rules are, especially, yeah, just I can't understand why they would do things sometimes. I really can't. And I scratch my head. I really do, especially in the accounting world and running a business. So Spain is full of common sense there. Some of the rules and regulations that the Portuguese have are just mind-boggling.
Really?
Absolutely mind-boggling. Yeah. So if there's not an invoice for goods and services within 2 days of money hitting the bank account, right? And sometimes we don't know in our industry, right, when money's going to hit the bank account, how much we're going to get, or where it comes from. We find out a week after.
Right.
We can't raise an invoice. So if we can't raise an invoice, you then get fined. And then another one, if you can't produce an invoice from a payment you've made from a bank account, right, of let's say we pay somebody €1,000 for computer services, right, and there's no invoice there, then we get fined another 50%, which is the tax. So the assumption is that we've paid somebody in cash, right, even though it's a bank transfer, and we then get fined 50% of the amount, which is the tax that other person would have paid, but isn't going to pay because he received it in cash. And it's just, hang on a second, whoa. And you find this out afterwards.
But this happens in Spain as well, not necessarily on the financial side, Andy, but you only know you've done something wrong when you get a note on your front door saying, we have something in the council offices that's in your interest. You go down there and it's like a fine for doing something, and you think, well, I didn't know I'd done anything wrong.
Correct. Yeah, it is stuff like that. But so Portugal in that case is the same as Spain, but less bureaucratic, I would say.
Right.
in many ways. Yeah.
And how is life, your day-to-day life in Portugal compared to the Costa del Sol, for example, Andy?
Again, all right, where we live, which is just quite close to the border, is beautiful. It's a beautiful old Roman town.
Mm,
Uh, it's a tourist attraction, but where in Spain, in August, in the Costa del Sol anyway, in August, it's almost claustrophobic,
yeah.
where there's queues out the supermarket, the roads are so busy, you can't get parked. You've got something similar, but it's probably two levels below what the Costa del Sol shows
Right.
there, and so it's much less, I think, taken over by tourists
Mm,
is one, and what else? So day to day life, I think, is more laid back.
right.
It is more laid back. Yeah,
Yeah, it's in 20 years, I've kind of noticed here a kind of increasing level of pressure and demand, and life does seem to be a lot faster here now than it was even 20 years ago.
yeah. I would tend to agree, and I saw that develop of the 10 years that I lived on the Costa del Sol before we moved to Portugal.
Yeah.
I saw that increase. I think the other thing which I noticed a difference is um, that the people who come here, especially working age, it's
Mm,
quite transient insofar as they'll come here for 2 3 years and then either the business doesn't work out or they get homesick and go back home or whatever and move.
yeah.
Um, that's difficult for the kids. That's difficult for building up relationships and friends and social circles as well. In Portugal, it tends to be, well, my experience so far, it's much more settled, and
Right.
people go there, and there's more of an attitude amongst the expats that we love this place and this is the place that we're going to live.
Yeah, so it's maybe about the kind of people that choose to come to somewhere like the Costa del Sol compared to the kind of people that decide to move to Portugal. They've maybe got a different mindset.
Yeah, possibly that's correct. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And without asking you to talk about your tax declarations, Andy, but are there big differences in the sort of taxation? I don't know, either at personal level or at business level between Spain and Portugal.
Business level, they're pretty similar,
Okay.
um, um, and there are some differences, but not to make a massive difference. From a personal level, however, Portugal have got this wonderful thing called the NHR regime, which means non-habitual residence, and essentially for the first 10 years that somebody goes there, if they apply for this regime and they're lucky enough to get it, then it means that there's a cap on the amount of income tax that's paid,
Wow.
and that cap's really really low.
Hmm.
Um, but then essentially everything else that they get, whether it's capital gains, whether it's interest, dividends, you name it, is tax free.
Wow.
So it
Right.
gives a lot of expats a chance to completely redesign what they've got and make it fit for purpose,
Yeah.
right, for when the 10th year arrives and they start being taxed again.
So, what you were talking about earlier, Andy, about ISAs being tax free in the UK but not in Spain.
Yeah.
If people were in that first 10 years in Portugal, would that make a difference to their tax liability if they decided to cash in their ISA?
No, none whatsoever.
None. Okay.
So everything literally bar income, of which there's a modest tax on, in those 10 years, everything is tax free.
Wow, so that could, for some people, be a big consideration then, couldn't it, Andy?
Huge, absolutely huge consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing that we noticed as well in terms of tax and cost of living is property prices, although the prices have risen in the market recently over the past 2 3 years in Portugal, are still way below, right, the property prices for a comparable property in Spain and the Costa del Sol. So cost of living is cheaper. Standard of living is the same, if not higher, depending on the style the way you want to live your life. And the tax burden on individuals, certainly under the NHR scheme, is much, much lower.
Wow. So when did we move to Portugal?
When I set up an estate agent, you can buy something from me.
I've actually seen houses in Portugal, but having said this, they're usually in some back and beyond rural area, and they've been neglected for 30 years. But I've seen them 36,000 with 3 acres of land, things like this. It's incredible.
Absolutely, it's bonkers. And there's, you know what, there are some really, really good bargains out there at the moment. But even a lovely developed urbanization, of which there are lots on the Costa del Sol, then again, the price of what you pay in Portugal still is much, much lower than here.
Yeah. So you're happy with? I mean, I know you're still working between the two places, Andy, but you're overall happy with your move to Portugal. It feels good.
Yeah, I love it. Absolutely love it. Holly loves it as well. I do. I love it.
Yeah. Andy, we've got just a couple of minutes left.
Okay.
Is there any kind of message you want to sort of get out there in terms of the personal wealth management? Any other sort of little nugget you want to leave people with?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great thing. Yeah, give me half an hour and I'll tell you. But I just think at the moment, one of the big risks that people face is inflation. And inflation,
Right.
I think central banks are struggling to get inflation back under control. The normal weapon they use is raising interest rates. I think they've got a terrible decision because how can they affect the price of oil, which is being artificially pushed higher, or the price of energy artificially pushed higher because of a war in Ukraine? So raising interest rates in the UK or Spain or the ECB or the US doesn't make a jot of difference.
Right.
And so there's one. But the rate of inflation at 10%, 11%, and 12%, that's going back to the 70s.
Mm.
And how much that kills, wealth if it's invested in the wrong areas is unbelievable. It destroys it at a huge rate.
Yeah.
And so I would just encourage people, if they can, to come and visit us or their IFA, whoever they are, and talk through all of their wealth, which pots it's in, where it sits, what it's there for, what they intend to do with it, what they want to spend it on, at some point in the future, and make sure that it's in the right place.
Right. Andy, thank you so much for joining me today. I always find these kind of chats interesting because I'm talking with you about things that really I don't know very much about. And I found your explanations to be really helpful. Andy, when are you heading back to Portugal?
I'm going back on Monday.
Right. Well, have a nice weekend on the Costa del Sol. Thank you so much for joining me today. And I'm sure we will keep in touch. Dave, thank you for producing the show today. To everyone, have a great weekend. Wherever you are, we've had about 97,000 people listening in 81 countries today, Andy.
Perfect. Hello, 91,000 expats.
Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll be back next week.